Hi, biology students. We're continuing our disease unit in microbiology now onto diseases of the cardiovascular and nervous systems. Let's start by discussing the Black Death, also known as the plague or the bubonic plague. This is a bacterial disease of historical significance. There have been at least 3 very large pandemics since the 6th century that have killed over 100 million people. And that was a big deal to be part of a pandemic back then because so little was known about transmission and treatment of infectious disease. This is some artwork that I found from Europe in the 1300s when there was a pandemic of plague that killed 30% of Europeans within just 5 years. So that gives you a little perspective on historical pandemics compared to our current 2020 pandemic of coronavirus, which is, compared to the plague, very insignificant. Luckily for us, we know a lot more now about infectious disease. But back then, they relied on maybe magic. This guy in the picture looks like he might be casting a spell of sorts, and they didn't understand what the transmission mechanism was. There was a very characteristic sign of the infection, though. These raised bumps all over the skin. It was actually swelling of the lymph nodes. Today, plague is classified as sporadic in the United States. Occasional epidemics occur in parts of the world. The reservoirs are still around. This is an example of a zoonotic disease. So remember, zoonotic means a disease that crosses into humans from wildlife, from animals, and it's spread from one of the major mechanisms of transmission is spread from animal to human. Nowadays, we know that this disease, plague, is caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, gram-negative Vibrio, a little curved rod. So methods of transmission. Vector transmission is the most common method of transmission for bubonic plague. So flea bites, and one of the ways that this pathogen ensures its transmission is that it blocks the esophagus of the flea. So the flea has difficulty taking a blood meal and begins to feel starved or ravenous. And so you get these hungry, ravenous fleas that will repeatedly and sort of ferociously bite people. And when the flea bites, the bacteria from the esophagus of the flea gets transmitted directly into the bloodstream of the human. Now, the reservoirs, the living reservoirs for plague include many different species of animals, mostly rodents. That historical plague pandemic I mentioned in Europe in the 1300s, they eventually, when historians looked back and tried to trace the infection, the early epidemiologists, they learned that it actually came from a living reservoir rat, and these were rats that had boarded ships from Asia and were carrying the bacteria, harboring the bacteria. Remember, that's what a reservoir means, to harbor the bacteria inside of the animal. And then the vector is the middleman. It's the transmitter to the human. And it were the fleas. So the fleas would bite the rats and pick up the bacteria, and then the fleas would pass the bacteria onto the human by biting. It is possible to handle one of the reservoir animals and to become directly bitten by that animal, and be transmitted directly from the living reservoir. It's also possible but rare to eat undercooked meat that's from one of the reservoir animals that is contaminated with the Yersinia bacteria and to become infected that way. Aerosol transmission from individuals with pneumonic plague. This is it's highly contagious. This particular form of plague, and just to clarify, though, this would actually be, because we've been using this term, this would be droplet. So it's not airborne, like it's not staying in the air for long periods of time, but if there are people coughing in close proximity to each other, then they can transmit pneumonic plague, which is actually the deadliest form of plague. So plague, we put it in the cardiovascular system group because the flea bite will introduce, so you'll have your flea bite as the vector, and then the bacteria is in the saliva of the flea, and that gets injected into the blood of the human. But then what happens is that the bacteria will eventually make their way from the blood into the lymphatic system. And remember, that is a very important system to our white blood cells. And so from the lymphatic system, eventually the bacteria will migrate via all these lymphatic vessels, which you see in green in this diagram, eventually to the lymph nodes. So this is a large picture of a single lymph node. But let's also circle the location of lymph nodes around the body. So in the neck, in the armpit, close to the shoulder, in the groin, and in the knees, around in here. So here we're looking at the location of lymph nodes. And so we go from lymphatic system to the lymph nodes. So that might seem unusual, because wouldn't a bacteria want to be getting away from the white blood cells rather than going to their hangout zone? That would make sense, other than the fact that Yersinia bacteria have a very unique virulence trait. And their virulence trait is that they can survive inside of macrophages, and that's actually how they replicate inside of macrophages. We've met other bacteria so far that do this, like Mycobacterium and Listeria also replicate inside of macrophages. I think I have a picture of that coming up here, but this is showing you the very characteristic sign of bubonic plague, one of the 3 forms of plague. And what we're seeing is those swollen lymph nodes as a result of infection. So we see these swollen lymph nodes, and we call that bubos. So the medical term for swollen lymph nodes would be bubos, okay? And this is just one of the locations where your lymph nodes could be swollen. So here we're seeing the Yersinia pestis bacteria in a blood stain, and we're seeing white blood cells in the midst here. Look like we have some monocytes and some neutrophils. Whoops. So remember the virulence trait. Survival inside of macrophages allows for them to resist digestion in phagocytosis. So they replicate inside of the macrophages. And as a result of the infection, we can have 3 forms of the plague, okay? So bubonic plague refers to the buboes, okay? So the sign of bubonic plague would be the swelling of the lymph nodes. So we're going to be looking for that clue of the swollen lymph nodes for bubonic plague. Septicemic plague would be a second stage, so the bubonic plague progresses. And what happens is that eventually lots of Yersinia bacteria rupture out of those macrophages. And of course, that's causing a lot of inflammation at the lymph node location, but also a lot of Yersinia bacteria gets into the blood. Now, we never want bacteria in the blood, okay? And if we get bacteria in the blood that's replicating and producing toxin, we get a condition we call septicemia. Okay, so septicemia is defined as a bacterial infection in the blood. This is particularly dangerous for bacteria that are gram-negative because of the type of toxin that is produced by gram-negative pathogens. Do you remember which type of toxin is produced by the gram-negatives? It's a part of their cell wall, right? The part of their cell wall called lipid A is called endotoxin. So this is also characterized by release of endotoxin, and then endotoxin triggers the reaction we're seeing here where we see all this blackening of the skin, okay, sort of this purplish blackish rash. This is an effect of endotoxin that's called, we talked about it in the first few lecture videos from last week. It's called DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation. So basically blood clotting that's being triggered by cytokine release as the immune system recognizes this particular invader, then endotoxin will trigger the immune system to begin to form fibrous clots inside of blood vessels, and this will starve tissue and block blood flow and will cause death of tissue, okay? Septicemia and endotoxin is also associated um, with shock, which is caused by hypotension, which means low blood pressure. And this is because of the vasodilation triggered as a form of the inflammatory response to endotoxin. The blood vessels become leaky and blood leaks out of the vessels, and then your blood pressure will drop, and that's called hypotension. And then that triggers a shock response where there's not enough blood flow to the organs, okay? And so we end up with multi-organ failure and then potentially death. Okay, it takes usually a couple weeks for septicemic plague to cause from start to finish of the disease. Now, pneumonic plague can develop once you have bacteria in the blood. Those bacteria can end up moving to other parts of the body. And so we usually then will progress to a pneumonic plague. And the pneumonic plague is the most deadly, with a mortality rate of nearly 100%. So this is the one I was saying where the pneumonic plague, we can get person-to-person transmission via the droplet, direct contact droplet transmission. okay? And it's the most deadly, it's also the most fast acting. So once somebody has pneumonic plague, their plague has progressed to a pneumonic plague, this death process is very, very fast. Look at the chest x-ray. There we've got severe inflammation in the lungs. And remember, that's another factor of endotoxin. So endotoxin is going to trigger what's called acute respiratory distress syndrome, or what we call ARDS. And that's going to cause severe inflammation in the lungs and lots of pus and not enough gas exchange. And that is extremely deadly. And for pneumonic plague, we're talking about really within 24 to 48 hours. If this person is not treated, they will die. So imagine a pandemic of that sort, which is what historically, we go back to the 1300s, this is one of the most recent pandemics involving the bubonic plague, transmitted by fleas, but progressing to septicemic plague, and then progressing to pneumonic plague, and then spreading within homes, within households, where all you had to do was cough, and you would be in close proximity to people and spread pneumonic plague to them. And very, very fast, once we actually begin seeing the symptoms of ARDS, this person has very little time to live. And of course, back then, there was no antibiotics, okay? So there was no way to really prevent this from happening. You can understand why this would tear through populations, wiping out 1 in 3, 30%, 1 in 3 people dying from this plague. Okay, moving on. Next disease, Lyme. Okay, Lyme disease. It gets its name because in the United States, there were a cluster of cases that were identified in the city of Lyme, Connecticut, in the United States. And this was in the 1970s. And the story goes that if you lived in Lyme, Connecticut in the 1970s and you were growing up there as a child, you were 10 times more likely than the national average to develop juvenile arthritis, okay, swelling in the joints. And a lot of children were developing this, and it's considered an autoimmune condition, which means your immune system decides to attack your own tissue, in this case, the cartilage and the joints. And so it was well accepted within the scientific community that this was an autoimmune condition. But eventually the CDC sent epidemiologists to research Lyme disease because it seemed to have an infectious disease origin. Mostly because, coincidentally, sometimes these children were being treated with antibiotics and the infection would go away. And so that was a clue that we're talking about some sort of bacterial pathogen rather than a direct autoimmune condition. But Lyme disease is definitely a very complicated and not a very well understood disease, even today. So eventually, the cause of the arthritis was determined, and it was in fact originating from a bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi, which is a gram-negative spirochete. This is how it appears under the microscope. And remember, spirochete have this sort of corkscrew appearance to them. You can see in the giant microbe form, it looks almost like a curly worm, okay? And the infections were more common in the summer months in Connecticut. The reason being is that in the summer months, you're more likely to be outside, going on hikes or walks, and that also tends to be the timing for when the baby ticks are feeding. And so that's the transmission. The transmission is vector. Again, another example of zoonotic disease, so a disease that transmitted into humans from wildlife. Humans are considered, we call humans actually are considered the dead end host, however, because Lyme disease does not get retransmitted to anybody else. Other than a few cases of Lyme disease being transmitted from mother, like a pregnant mother to baby, we really consider Lyme disease to be non-communicable between humans. Okay, other than mother to fetus, so pregnant mother to fetus. By the way, I want to give you the terminology for that, for mother to fetus. What do we call that? An infectious disease? We call that vertical transmission. And it's a type of direct transmission. Because you have an infected pregnant mom, and then the bacteria transmits to her fetus. So that's considered direct transmission. It's called vertical transmission. We also use that same terminology if infectious agents pass from breast milk. So once the baby is born and the baby is in contact with the mother and say breastfeeding, it can also transmit through the breast milk. Now that's not the case with Lyme disease, but it can. There are cases of it being transmissible in utero during the fetal development stages. But other than that, we consider humans are what we call the dead end host, meaning that it doesn't pass to anybody else. Okay, so the normal life cycle, because it's a zoonotic disease, normally we have the reservoirs being the deer, although it can be in rodents and it can be in dogs. Okay, and likely some other animals as well, but those are sort of the major reservoirs. And so um, the deer are holding on to the bacteria, and they're actually not they're infected, but they're not symptomatic. Okay, um, it seems to be sort of a normal pathogen for the deer, or a normal microbiota for the deer, not pathogenic in the deer. And so the ticks, of course, feed on the deer, and then they pick up the bacteria in their salivary glands. And then you're walking through the forest and a tick lands on you. And a little bit different though than with the fleas, where fleas will immediately bite you if a flea lands on you. Ticks, it can take some time. So the tick actually has to burrow its head into your skin, and that takes some time for it to do that. And the research suggests it's not immediate transmission of Lyme disease from a tick bite. So it is possible to remove a tick and not even an infected tick, and to not actually have contracted the Lyme disease. So the best course of prevention for Lyme disease in humans right now is just to check yourself, and to have people check you for ticks, check in your hair, check, have somebody check your back. Look for where these ticks are burrowing into your skin. If you're in the summer months, you can wear insect repellents. You can wear long sleeves. We do have Lyme disease in California, primarily in Northern California, although there are sporadic cases here in even Southern California. We do have the particular species of tick. So it has to be a particular species of tick. And the type of bacteria we have here is Borrelia. Now Borrelia burgdorferi. Now there are different species of Borrelia actually that reside in other countries. So they're sort of their own Lyme disease version in Asia and in Europe, and different species of Borrelia and different species of ticks. So um, just so you're aware there. So what happens is then the tick will burrow into your skin, and it has to embed its entire head into your skin. And then eventually it'll actually spew out its saliva into your bloodstream. And the spirochete bacteria is in there, the Borrelia bacteria is in their saliva secretions. So they'll secrete that into your bloodstream. Okay. Um, there's no vaccine right now, except for dogs. Okay, so there is a dog vaccine. Um, However, the vaccine in humans was a bit controversial. They had one. They actually did develop a vaccine for human use, but they decided to pull it from the market and do further testing on it once it was determined how complicated the Lyme disease is, and also the effect Lyme disease has on the immune system. So let's talk about the stages of Lyme disease next. Okay, so there are three major stages of Lyme disease. The first stage, this one, we actually call early localized. So this would be the early localized stage, or we'll just call it first stage or early localized. Following the bite of the tick, and assuming you don't remove the tick and the tick has a chance to burrow its head and spit into your blood, okay? It's going to spit out the Borrelia bacteria. And then this, not always, but in about 80% of the cases, people will develop a large circular rash at the site of the tick bite. Although it doesn't have to be at the site of the tick bite, it could actually be in other spots as well. And they also have sort of flu-like symptoms, so they might have just sort of a low-grade fever and feel kind of weak. Um, here's what the rash looks like. This rash has we call it erythema migrans, or EM. So erythema just means redness, and migrans means spreading. So it seems to spread in this very unique pattern. Looks like a bullseye rash. Sometimes it's just called bullseye rash. It tends to be on the arms or on the knees if it does show up. And like I said, it doesn't always show up. If it does show up, this is a very characteristic rash, and this person needs immediate antibiotics. This is really the only time you can be treated effectively for Lyme disease. So antibiotics are effective at this stage. It's early localized because the tick, usually right around that tick bite, bacteria have entered the blood. There's a localized inflammatory response in this very characteristic pattern. And anybody who presents with this particular sign of the infection would absolutely be treated with antibiotics. Okay, it's usually doxycycline for actually it's a long course of doxycycline. I think it's like 21 days. So you absolutely want to get rid of that bacteria, and this is really the time to do it, because what happens next we don't really understand actually within the medical community. And if you know anybody who's contracted Lyme disease or know anything about what's going on in the medical community regarding Lyme disease, you might know that there's a lot of controversy and a lot of disagreement among patients and their doctors about what's happening in later stages of Lyme disease. So what happens is, if, let's say, the patient doesn't show the rash and they just think they have a flu and they just don't go in and get the treatment they need, um, then it will progress. And so the bacteria somehow enter the nervous system. We don't entirely know how it does this, but the Lyme bacteria will enter the nervous system. It might be as a result of its corkscrew shape that it can sort of burrow. Remember, it sort of looks like a spiral noodle that it can sort of burrow deep into cells and maybe evade the immune system that way. It's not entirely clear, but what can happen is following a Lyme, um, following the early localized stage, we begin to see some neurological symptoms. And so this neurological stage involves many different, what we call encephalopathies. Encephalopathies. See if I could spell it. So what can happen in the second stage, it's a neurological stage. And this includes several encephalopathies, including memory loss, sort of brain fog, facial paralysis, as well as meningitis. Third stage is considered a chronic stage of the infection that triggers autoimmunity. Again, we're not entirely sure how, but the bacteria tend to burrow into joints, into neural tissue, and trigger a very painful arthritic condition. And remember, that is what the original diagnosis was for the children living in Lyme, Connecticut, when this was first diagnosed back in the 1970s. So the problem is that we don't entirely understand all of this, and many doctors are actually, um, for whatever reason, feel as though some patients have more of a what's called a psychosomatic condition, which means sort of made up symptoms. Um, I definitely don't understand why that would be the opinion of certain medical doctors, but um, it does seem to lead to some very difficult situations for people. I knew somebody who had Lyme disease. She was a colleague of mine years ago, and she ended up developing the paralysis so severely that she could no longer teach. She said she was in just continuous pain in her joints and paralysis in her joints, and um, so it can become a chronic lifelong condition. That's not very well understood. Um, there is another tick-borne disease that you should be aware of. It's called Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever, caused by an entirely different bacteria. It's called Rickettsia rickettsii, with deer and dog reservoirs. This one produces a non-itchy spotted rash on the trunk and appendages, including palms and soles, with muscle aches and nausea associated with that. This is what the rash looks like for Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever, which, by the way, was first identified in the Rocky Mountains. But when we look at areas of the United States that are endemic, remember that means commonly associated, these are the areas here, the geographical locations. So more of the southeastern states. So southeastern U.S. is associated with Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever cases, another tick-borne illness caused by a bacteria. Very different rash though, so that would be a clue to distinguish it from Lyme disease, where Lyme disease, really the hotspot areas are here, northeastern US. This is more where we would find Lyme disease there. And then occasionally we also see, just to add something to this map, usually in the southwest, if we do have any sporadic cases of plague, occasional, once in a while, once or twice a year, not very often, but and no huge pandemics anymore with plague because it's so well understood and so easily treated with antibiotics. We don't worry about it spreading like wildfire like it did in the 1300s. But so southwestern US is associated with very sporadic cases of plague. Still around today. Okay, meningitis, next disease. Now, bacterial meningitis can be caused by multiple bacterial pathogens. There's also viral meningitis, which is usually slower acting than bacterial meningitis, but many of the symptoms are very similar. Okay, so the possible bacterial pathogens, Neisseria meningitidis is perhaps the most common in adults. Gram-negative diplococci, so this we see in young adults. This made a comeback in the 1990s, and occasionally you see this show up on college campuses where we have students that live in dormitories, where we have students living in close proximity to each other. Occasionally we'll get some localized outbreaks of bacterial meningitis. Now, this one is prevented, at least some strains. It doesn't prevent against all strains, but some strains of the Neisseria bacteria are prevented by the meningococcal vaccine. Less common, so these two here, the Streptococcus pneumoniae and the Haemophilus influenza, we talked about both of those in a previous lecture. We talked about their role in pneumonia-like symptoms. Now, these are more commonly seen in children, so children under 5. Also preventable by their childhood vaccinations. So pneumococcal vaccine is protecting children not only from the Streptococcus pneumoniae bacteria or bacterial pneumonia, but also from bacterial meningitis. And the same thing with the Haemophilus influenza bacteria. Okay, so transmission is by either direct contact, so saliva, kissing, it resides in the back of the throat, okay, so it's going to be present in the saliva, mucous membranes of the mouth. It's possible from sharing drinks, especially at a party where maybe people are drinking beer or some sort of beverage and passing the can around, or passing the bottle around and everybody's taking a sip. That is a great way to transmit bacterial meningitis. Or droplet transmission. So if somebody is coughing with meningitis, they can spread that to people in close proximity to them. Portal of entry, nose and throat. Okay. So meningitis gets its name because it's inflammation of the meninges, okay, tissues around the brain and the spinal cord. So signs and symptoms, the patient will experience neck stiffness, very severe neck stiffness, where it becomes incredibly painful to take your chin and try to touch your chin to your chest. So trying to do this motion would be very painful, if not impossible. okay, for somebody with bacterial meningitis. And that's because there is swelling around the brain and around the spinal cord. A lot of times it's mistaken for flu. There have been some very tragic cases in the news at especially college campuses because, well, it also resembles a hangover, okay? So it also, people could mistakenly think they just have a hangover and not realize they actually have bacterial meningitis. And there have been tragic cases where they've even been turned away by the college nurse who says, well, it's the flu, go home and just relax, you'll be fine in a couple days. And that is very dangerous because what can happen with meningitis is this bacteria can enter the blood, okay? And for Neisseria meningitidis, in particular, because it's gram negative, it can release endotoxin that causes that DIC condition. So we get septicemia, very characteristic purple rash. And here what you're seeing is they're taking a glass cup and they're pushing it against the rash, and it doesn't, and the rash stays red, it doesn't turn white. It's called the tumbler test. And that basically means that that this is the condition that we've talked about before. If you recall, it's another condition associated with endotoxin release. The endotoxin is released into the blood, and then we're going to get that clotting, the DIC condition, where we're going to get blood clots forming, and we're going to get tissue death and necrosis and blackening, and kind of starts purpley, and then it looks sort of blackish rash on the skin. If you get a chance, watch this video, and this shows you on a college campus in the United Kingdom, somebody who comes down with bacterial meningitis and the experience he has with it. The problem is if you experience this flu-like symptoms and the stiff neck, and you do just go back to your house and try to sleep it off, it's very possible it'll progress to the septicemia. So the septicemia is when you see this purple rash start to form on your hands and feet, and that is very dangerous because as a result of that, remember, endotoxin can also cause shock and multiple organ failure and then death. That is the feature of endotoxin, and that is something we see with bacterial meningitis. Very rapid onset. Within even just 24 hours, somebody can develop the septicemia and die overnight. So it's a very serious condition, but there are prevention. There are the vaccines for prevention. I do want to mention that one way to detect bacterial meningitis, now it's not a fun test, okay, but what they can do is they can do something called a lumbar puncture. So they will detect, so the diagnose, so it's called a lumbar puncture, and this is they're going to collect a type of fluid we call cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that bathes your spinal cord in your brain, and it will be full of pus, okay? It'll be full of pus, and they can gram stain the bacteria, they can do a genetic analysis on the bacteria, they can detect the bacteria from a lumbar puncture and know that it is, in fact, bacterial meningitis. Here we can see the effect on the brain, the hemorrhaging that can occur within the brain if this continues to progress and cause death. So normal brain versus infected brain. Okay, so now we're on to our very last two diseases of the nervous system, and they are diseases caused by bacteria within the genus Clostridium. So this disease is botulism. It's caused by Clostridium botulinum, which is a bacteria that is gram-positive, it's spore-forming, and it resides normally in the soil. So it has a non-living reservoir, being the soil, and in water. So this produces a very potent exotoxin. So remember, there's variable kinds of exotoxins that can be secreted by either gram-positive or gram-negative bacteria. They always have some sort of target organ that they infect. So botulinum toxin is a type of neurotoxin, and it prevents muscle contraction, so it causes flaccid paralysis. We actually see in the picture here, we see a child infected with what's called infant botulism, sometimes referred to as floppy baby syndrome, because the baby cannot, looks sort of like a rag doll, can't hold up the baby can't hold up its head, or its limbs are sort of flopping around. Um, Muscle contraction is blocked by the toxin, the action of the botulinum toxin. Another feature you should consider is that because it's a spore producer, it can survive in anaerobic conditions. So this is usually how it gets passed to humans, is that the spores get packaged in with canned foods or vacuum sealed foods, gets contaminated somehow, usually because you're canning, you might be canning fruits or vegetables that were grown outside in the soil. And this is a soil bacteria. There's spores in the soil. And so the spores can get trapped into canned foods. And then when you eat that food, the spores will germinate back into active bacterial cells that will then start secreting this toxin in your gut. And then eventually that toxin will get to your nervous system. And the flaccid paralysis will eventually affect it'll affect your diaphragm, which is a very important muscle that helps with breathing. And that is actually what causes death, is that you cannot contract the diaphragm correctly to for respiration. So foodborne botulism, that we usually refer to that in adults, and usually what that's associated with is eating foods that are contaminated with spores. Infant botulism is usually eating honey. So it's recommended not to feed children under 1 years old honey, because honey is, again, it's an environmental food that can be contaminated with the Clostridium bacteria. And for young children, they may not have the immune system power to clear that bacteria, where in adults, if we do come in contact with it, a lot of times we're able to destroy that bacteria. So usually what happens is the honey might have some bacteria in it, and then those bacteria will begin producing toxin. So that has been associated. Also, just eating dirt in general. So kids eating dirt, they could definitely transmit botulism and have these symptoms of the flaccid paralysis, the floppy baby syndrome. So because this is a fast-acting toxin that needs to be blocked, the treatment is usually antitoxin. So it's an antibody. So you get treated with a botulism antibody. So what it does is the antibody will bind directly to wherever that neurotoxin is present and prevent it from acting on your nervous system. And then usually you're also treated with antibiotics to kill off any active cells that could be growing in your intestines and causing the illness. Tetanus is caused by another member of the genus Clostridium. Different species. This is Clostridium tetani, also gram-positive, also endospore, also in the soil. So the transmission of tetanus is usually puncture wound into the skin. Okay. Sort of the classic example of getting tetanus is you step on a nail. You step on a nail outside, and the nail drives the bacteria deep into your skin, and then the Clostridium bacteria multiply and begin making toxin, produces the tetanus toxin. This has the opposite effect of the botulism toxin. So this actually causes rigid paralysis. Okay, so it prevents muscle relaxation. The muscle contraction is so intense. Look at the pictures here. Look at these people. They are in pain, incredible pain from tetanus contractions. The tetanus rigid paralysis symptoms, usually it starts with your jaw, the muscle in you that holds your jaw just locking. We call that lock jaw. But eventually it progresses to other muscles as well. And the muscle contractions are so intense, it can break bones. It's that intense. If you've ever had a Charlie horse in your leg, you probably, get a little, just small idea of what that's like. But imagine such severe contractions, it breaks bones. Oh, I've got the lockjaw there. It can be fatal. It's the other problem. It's the problem of, again, the diaphragm. This time, that muscle that controls your breathing mechanism cannot relax, and then you can't have proper gas exchange in your lungs, and so it's respiratory paralysis again is the cause of death. Same as botulism, just different action. Okay, but it's still a respiratory paralysis, a flaccid paralysis for botulism, a rigid paralysis for tetanus. Okay, so treatment, because we also have another exotoxin, another neurotoxin, is to use the immunoglobulin, so to use an antitoxin called TIG, okay, for tetanus immunoglobulin. So it's an antibody. Okay, so it's an antitoxin. Antibiotics, and then just so you're aware, prevention is the DTaP. So getting the DTaP booster every 10 years is recommended. And of course, DTaP protects you against 3 different pathogens we've learned about so far. So we've learned about diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. So protects against those 3.